Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 76. People are losing trust in politics, in media, and in science. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast, we're looking at one piece of that puzzle with a scholar who's unpacking the growing distrust of experts and what happens when outrage and identity start shaping how we see science itself.
My name is Hillary Shulman, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Communication at Ohio State University.
Hillary Shulman's recent research explores something called science populism, a worldview where people see science as an elite enterprise disconnected from everyday life. We talk about how this mindset crosses political lines, what it means for trust in experts, and how communicators can bridge that gap. Hillary Shulman, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so in this paper, it's a term I hadn't seen used before, so I don't know if you sort of invented it or it's just a term that I saw, but I saw this term of science populism. So can you start by telling us a little bit what that means?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So science populism, I don't want to say it's recent, but it's certainly gotten more attention recently. And it's very much derived from what we think of as political populism, right? Which is all about the public and what's in the public interest. And it's usually the public pitted against these elites who try to do things for their own self-serving interest, usually at the sake of the common man or the public or the common good. You see those types of words in populism. And so what this paper kind of wanted to do was take political populism, but apply it to science, where we're seeing a lot of these dynamics as well. So how there's this kind of corrupt elite class of scientists who are telling the regular person what to do, telling them not to trust their their intuitions. And for these reasons, people who are more likely to have the science populism perspective are more likely to disregard or be less interested in scientific information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, you see this. I think you see this in our regular lives without having to read a scientific paper on it.
You do. But I think what's helpful about the science populism lens is that we kind of talk about science skepticism. And there are certainly people who are science skeptics, but that's kind of like defining the term with its consequent. Who are science skeptics? Well, they're people who are science skeptical. But I think what the science populism term does is it gives us a worldview or an understanding for why they might be skeptical. And the reason is because they think science isn't produced by people like them. And scientists have this different agenda that in some places can be like antagonistic with the average person. And that's why they're more likely to resist or be skeptical of scientific information and to seek out information from what they perceive as non-elite sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the paper, it talks about science populists as being notoriously challenging demographic. And I don't think the paper actually quantified this, but how common is this among the population? I mean, what percentage of people might fit this definition?
It's a growing number. What percentage? I'm not sure, right? Because the way we conducted this research is we didn't select on science populism. We just asked for 875 adults enrolled in a panel who are interested in taking part in this research. And then what we did from this is we kind of split people who tended to be higher than the mean or lower than the mean in science populism. So from this paper, I can't generalize. But also this shouldn't be seen as like science populism or not science populist, right? I think everybody has a little populist in them. And then also there are certain science topics that are more prone to populism, right? The main ones being vaccines, climate change, and genetically modified foods, right? Those are places where we might see a bit more populism. And I think one thing that I want to stress about science populism is this occurs across the political spectrum. So I think sometimes when we've talked about science skepticism in the past, we conflate that with like conservatives. And that's not the case. Very liberal people can be science populist as well. And that's why I think this is a helpful worldview into understanding, like, why on earth wouldn't somebody trust a scientist? They're the expert. That seems strange or unintuitive to the average person. But the science populist world view, I think is helpful for beginning to understand this group and reach them for things that are important.
Hmm. Yeah, I was, there was a relationship, and the paper talks about a relationship, sort of a connection between conservatism and science populism, but it was what we might call moderate, I suppose. In other
Yeah.
words, it's not absolute, and you make a point in the paper to, say that the two kind of have some overlap, but they're definitely distinct.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Again, we are talking a lot about political polarization, and that's one of the purposes of this podcast, for example. And I think that is true. And there are certainly parts about a conservative political identity that are more prone to populist thinking, kind of the anti-institution, anti-establishment sentiment, but they are not actually the same thing. And so you can't neatly apply somebody who's conservative to like, well, then why won't they listen to their doctor? Why won't they listen to, somebody from the NIH or whatever, the National Institute of Health? So, it's important to say that there are some political elements, but this is something that's transcending politics. And I would also say post-pandemic, we're starting to see the growth in this sort of thinking in the political space, but in the science space as well. And these are not necessarily overlapping populations.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that's interesting and important to like remember. It's so easy to kind of put a political lens on everything. But there are other reasons why people might be skeptical about the information they're receiving from experts.
Right, and you also broke it down into different sources too, right? So it's not necessarily like whether sort of asking the question of whether this science populism reflects kind of a blanket distrust, or is it more selective? Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another way of trying to explore something that at a general level seems true, like science skepticists are skeptical about science. Like, yeah, sure, but what does that actually mean? Does that mean if your doctor tells you something, you're not going to do it? Does that mean that people who work for different sort of maybe pharmaceutical industries, industry scientists, as we call them, like you don't trust them, or you're not trusting your professors or people in the academic community? So I think again, it's easy to refute experts in general. But when you actually ask them, and this is what one of the questions we had, when you actually make the scientific profession more nuanced, do they still feel comfortable saying, no, I don't think they're very credible? And we found here that people do have nuance, even science populists. Science populists, for example, tend to trust medical doctors, right? They do not have the same sort of reactance to maybe it's their personal physician or just physicians in general. But they do, however, have some reactance to who they perceive to be government-based sources. So in our study, that was people who work for the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and the NIH, the National Institute of Health. And we use those because COVID's probably still somewhat top of mind. So we thought that would be interesting. Again, what do people think about when they think about scientists? I don't think they're asked that as much in scientific research.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this was very interesting to me. Like I was kind of struck by that both groups still seem to rate research sources pretty trusted, which kind of surprised me a little bit and gave me some hope maybe. But and it seemed like the real split, the bigger gap was kind of in this government affiliated science. And I guess one thing about this paper that makes me think that there's kind of next steps is asking the question a lot more about the why that you were kind of getting into.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was encouraged to see that too. And I think that speaks to when you talk about scientists in general, it's easy to discount what they're saying. But when you actually ask people, like, oh, do you think people working at universities, for example, don't have a lot of credibility, don't have a lot of expertise? People are more likely to say, well, like, no, I think they probably do. Right. So it's an idea of kind of stereotype versus actuality. Like, what are people thinking about when they're thinking about scientists? And I personally think when we have our own touch points for people in our lives, when we're like, well, I know a professor and they were pretty great and they didn't seem particularly elite, or people who work for pharmaceutical companies. So like I can understand them. They're just trying to get the best product out there to make money. Like I understand this. So again, when you stop with the generalities and start with the specifics, we see a lot of kind of science skepticism break down and people be
Mm-hmm.
more open-minded about these sources. So I think that's actually quite encouraging from this research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this might be a little bit of a controversial question, but I think it speaks a lot to the nuance you were kind of mentioning before, that this isn't kind of a black and white thing, that you're not either sort of all science populists or not. And I think about some of the changes happening with, sort of movements like RFK's, Make America Healthy Again, kind of influencing these agencies, and even and so I could see some people being sort of science or maybe political populists, or maybe political populists. Maybe this more is like what you were saying earlier about being just generally skeptical. But like I know for myself, I'm probably going to trust the numbers coming out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics less with some of the recent changes than I might have, in the past.
What happens in the future is going to be really interesting. So from a populist worldview, again, there's the corrupt elite and there is the kind, good-hearted common person. But when a government becomes populist, and I think it's reasonable to say RFK Jr. Definitely has a more populist lens. A lot of the rhetoric Donald Trump uses is more populist in nature. And I think, again, big question, but whether or not people kind of perceive that the elite or the ruling class is no more, right? And now the stuff that comes out of there is more similar to kind of the average opinion on these things. Like, will this persist? Will people now start trusting government sources because will populists start liking these sources because they view them as more consistent with their own worldview? I don't know. Right. We still have institutions and we still have people, but who's in institutions is different. So whether or not something like the Maha movement fundamentally um, changes these dynamics, who know? Or whether people start to be like, well, you know what, I kind of liked when we had vaccine doctors, making decisions and not whoever might be there now. Right. So maybe we'll see some reactions or blowback to these decisions. I'm just not sure.
Yeah. But I think it does speak to this idea that these aren't kind of absolute things.
No, I mean, here's kind of another interesting wrinkle in this kind of populism idea. And some of my colleagues at Ohio State have talked about this a lot, like Kelly Garrett, but there's this thing called like epistemic beliefs, which is a fancy way of saying like what types of information or data do we value when making a decision? And again, to simplify this, there are thinkers and there are feelers, right? There are people who need to know the data and need to see data in order to make a decision. And then there are feelers who believe in sort of intuition, personal anecdote, and things that just sort of feel right, right? Because they resonate with their own reality. And populism does tend to comport more with kind of this feeling, right? I don't know if it is right, but it feels like it should be. So again, this is kind of further complicating the fact, or maybe even explaining why they might be reactant to like, I'm giving you the data. Like, yeah, but the data doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right because somebody like me didn't produce it. Or you're not listening, or you're going to discount somebody like me, or you're not going to ask the type of questions that I'd want to ask. So again, there's a lot of dynamics at play, but they do help explain why something that seems so scientifically evidenced might still be met with considerable resistance.
Yeah, and you see this. I mean, you see that. I mean, all of us do it. I've talked to enough psychologists on this show to know that none of us are really immune to this kind of thing. Even if we think we're thinkers, we also are feelers, whether we think so or not.
Yeah, especially in areas that we care a great deal about. Right. And I mean, one limitation of this paper too is that this is a really interesting area, and I myself am just starting to get into it. But we were completely topic agnostic. We did not ask about a doctor of science versus a doctor of philosophy, right? Or a climate change scientist versus a regular, whatever that might be. We did not contextualize this. And I think if we did, we would surprise ourselves in seeing how much, how who as a science populist can shift depending on what the topic is. I think everybody has a little populist in them, probably. I think everybody has a little conspiracist in them, which is something that's related.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it depends.
Right. Exactly. Well, I couldn't help but sort of notice, reading through the paper and just thinking about this category or this topic that, here I am basically sitting in, I guess, the media category in some sense, kind of as a would-be journalist and an influencer of some sort. And so what should somebody like me take away from this research? Like, if we're trying to earn the credibility with audiences that may lean towards science populism, what's an important thing to keep in mind?
Well, that's a good question. So we had one of our science sources was just like influencers, right? So we had a TV source, which is kind of like we even said like the Dr. Phil, Dr. Oz, people who are like very much TV doctors who try to give advice in accessible ways. But then there is this whole host of influencers, and that is not a not a monolithic category. And I think the one thing to think about for influencers is knowing your audience. I think one thing that maybe or maybe not would surprise listeners in our study, it showed that liberal people, very liberal people, actually rated influencers as slightly more credible than very conservative audiences. So I think I would refrain from making general statements, but I think you need to know your audience. I think the people who are most successful in like the podcast industry are people who say like, my audience is a bunch of thinkers. And so I'm going to give them a whole bunch of academics to talk about their data versus people who are like, my audience is all just feelers. And so I'm just going to get them fired up about the topics that I know they care about. So, that's the best way to get attention. But whether or not we're talking about attention or the public good is something.
Yeah, I would hope to lean towards the public good side. I mean, that is technically part of our mission with our affiliation with the Connors Institute. Providing quality information in the public good. So, and I feel like something you mentioned there about trusting influencers, and I feel there's a bit of a burden there because I have built a trust relationship with the audience, right? And I have to be now that it comes with responsibility. Like, I should probably be careful. Yeah. Like, I want to be a little careful here. So it's a challenge a little bit.
It is a challenge. And I think what's also a challenge and a very interesting one. So, I study communication. Some of my roots are just studying persuasion. And one thing influencers or any sort of podcaster has a tremendous advantage of is that they don't select their audience selects them, right? So right off the bat, they're kind of ahead of the game, right? Because people want to listen to you. It's not like, network TV where you have to watch whoever's on at a certain time. That's an old model in general. But, and if you like the person, like people who like Joe Rogan and are listening to like 3 hours of him, however many times a week, like, of course, they're going to be influenced by what he says. And of course, he's going to have a power. And the bigger the audience, the more the power. So, yeah, it's, you start with a big advantage, and that's an opportunity, but it is also a responsibility, to your point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the paper, there are some recommendations, but to be frank, they're a little broad, and some stuff like making scientific practices more transparent, maybe using doctors more, since, like, as you mentioned earlier, doctors seem to be a category that people tended to trust. And also this idea of meeting people where they are, which I do love that. And I think that's so important, but that's also kind of hard to exactly always figure out what that means in a practical sense. So, given that, would you have any ideas, sort of more concrete, actionable things that either some science institutions might do, or are those trying to communicate might do?
Yeah, I think I have some reasonably helpful recommendations, although those can be applied to a variety of situations. But so this is the important point about understanding why somebody is science skeptical, not simply that they are skeptical. And the why, going back to populism, is the narrative, right? That there's this like ruling class that is separate from physically, philosophically, in terms of their self-interest. They are different from ordinary people, right? That's very much like the populist rhetoric. And so if you want to undermine that worldview, then what you have to do is you can't sit in your ivory tower and perpetuate that stereotype. Is you have to say, like, I'm not elite at all. right? Talk to me, let's discuss, let me explain why, I'm not just able to write a grant about anything I want, how incredibly competitive these things are, how you have to write in such particular, neutral, unbiased ways in order to get published. Like, I think people don't realize that. And of course, that's not their fault. That has nothing to do with perhaps their profession. But by kind of making these two worlds more integrated is the kryptonite to the populist worldview. And any sort of action that says, like, no, I don't have a separate agenda from you. I am here for the public agenda. In fact, you being healthy, you listening to me supports my work. I'm trying to do work to make things better. There's no ulterior motive. I'm not super rich because I'm a college professor, right? I don't get kickbacks from grants. Like, these are the types of things that break down that sort of us versus them dynamic. And so, to your point about specific recommendations, however you can do that, I do think professors have an obligation to attack actual problems as opposed to just theoretical ones. I think podcasts such as yourselves, your podcast is a great vehicle for just kind of letting people listen to academics who maybe didn't go to college or haven't been in quite some time to be like, oh, I get it. I understand who these people are, and they don't seem different than myself. You know, and anything that bridges those divides, I think professors, to your point, have an obligation to also speak in more accessible language and care more about the accessibility of their work. That's actually what most of my research is on, is breaking down those barriers and those perceived barriers to understanding. So I don't think I got more specific in that answer to your question, but if the goal is to break that worldview that elites, academic scientists, and the public are divided, any sort of effort that undermines that perspective should be helpful.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I love it. And it seems like there's opportunities in the whole systems as well. Like you were talking about the challenges of getting a peer-reviewed paper published, and no one's going to write a paper using sort of eighth grade language that an eighth grader can understand. Right? That paper's not going to get published.
Correct. So I once wrote a paper about jargon, and it was basically how when you use, in this case, it was scientific jargon, people automatically don't like the work as much. And one of the reasons they don't like the work as much is because they feel it's not like their sort of thing. In other words, they misattribute the effort and the difficulty of reading the work to being something inherently like wrong with them. They're like, this isn't my thing. I'm not smart enough. I guess I'm not a science person. I don't like it. I'm out. But the audience of that journal isn't everyday people. There are starting to be more journals that are targeted towards that, but we do rely on science communicators to translate that information and tell the public why they should care. But maybe just like kind of hot take, like maybe that intermediary step needs to be a little smoother, needs to go a little quicker.
Right. Because one of my, sort of pet peeves and something I'm trying to avoid on this show is, many of those hot takes that you see of these science papers, A, they often seem to get it wrong. Like that wasn't in the paper at all. And B, or they try to like sort of politicize it, right? They're, this paper is saying, conservatives are terrible or liberals are terrible or whatever. And, and that typically is not what the paper is saying, right?
No, I appreciate that, but I also do understand the journalist side. Like, as an academic who wants to be fair and produce the best science I can, I don't want to say it's almost never interesting because that's not fair, but I can't write in a way that is declarative. I can't say like, and thus we found that we can't write like that. That will never get published. We have to be careful. We have to acknowledge our limitations. We have to acknowledge the biases in our language. We have to consider why our study worked the way it did, why it didn't, the idiosyncrasies of who we asked. I mean, we really have to be so critical of our own work. So that leads to kind of more neutral language, and it leads to every caveat you can imagine. But I do recognize that these caveats and this new nuance do not necessarily make for interesting content. So as a result, when these studies are published, they're not given the nuance that the authors acknowledge. But that's just kind of a feature of attention. And, but again, I think scientists being given more of a voice to express yeah, that's a good point. I can't answer that question. Or actually, no, that's a limitation of the paper, is something we do all the time. We are hypercritical of ourselves and of one another, but the public only sees the finished product. So, or even those are often behind paywalls. So it's relied on people who have access to distill that information down, and there's problems in translation there. So, a lot of barriers, but I think, there's a lot of motivations to start reducing these.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. I think, this can be a difficult space. I know a lot of people get frustrated with, I think science communication has struggled for years, trying to solve these kinds of problems, right? And it's nice to see some work maybe helping us understand a little better and maybe find paths that can improve it, because it's a critical problem. And I think you have, like you say, when you're self-critical like this, a big piece of that is being self-critical, like, hey, maybe I am part of an elite institution. Oh, wait. And maybe, even going that far, right? Hey, okay, is that a valid concern?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to always try to be better. You always have one answer leads to three more questions. And we're always kind of trying to figure out what's the best solution. And even the best solution is just usually the better solution than a whole lot of imperfect options. But I think we provide a public service in thinking about things a different way. And again, trying to explain the why. If you understand the why, then solutions become more apparent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Well, Hillary Shulman, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
I really appreciate those insights.
Thank you.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If something in this episode sparked a thought, or maybe even lit a fire, I'd love to hear from you. You can leave a voice message or even schedule a quick one-on-one chat right from our contact page at outrageoverload.net/contact. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Before we go, I want to give a quick shout out to a podcast friend. This isn't an ad, just a friend whose show I think you might enjoy. Here's a short promo.
Hey, welcome to Dad Space. This is a podcast for dads by dads. And if you're a dad, if you know a dad, then we have a space for you. It's called Dad Space. You can find us at dadspace.ca. My name is Dave. I'm excited to have you join us over at dadspace.ca. Thanks for listening.